Bonsoir à toutes et à tous. Merci de nous rejoindre. C'est un plaisir de se retrouver à nouveau pour ce rendez-vous du Gákte-Quipo. Pour ce troisième rendez-vous en ligne, nous recevons aujourd'hui deux artistes autochtones multidisciplinaires. Barry Ace, qui nous rejoint depuis Ottawa, au Canada, et Cannupa Hanska Luger, qui vit au Nouveau-Mexique, aux États-Unis. La rencontre entre ces deux artistes sera modérée par Damien Kunik, conservateur responsable des collections Asie du MEG. Et je suis Lucie Monod, conservatrice restauratrice au MEG, et je vais brièvement introduire la rencontre qui va suivre. Je vais commencer par quelques informations techniques. La rencontre entre les artistes se fera en anglais et leur échange sera interprété en français. Comme ma présentation introductive est en français, vous pouvez rester sur ce canal pour suivre l'interprétation française de la rencontre qui va suivre. Si par contre vous voulez suivre la rencontre en anglais, vous pouvez cliquer sur le globe qui se trouve en bas de votre fenêtre Zoom et choisir le canal anglais de la rencontre. Si vous avez des questions techniques, dans un premier temps, n'hésitez pas à utiliser le système Q&R qui se trouve en bas de votre fenêtre Zoom. Vous pourrez aussi ainsi transmettre des questions aux artistes pour les 10 dernières minutes de la rencontre. Et si vous nous rejoignez sur Facebook et que vous souhaitez poser des questions, vous pouvez cliquer sur le lien en commentaire qui vous conduira à nous rejoindre sur Zoom. Comme les deux rencontres précédentes de ce rendez-vous du Gákte-Quipo, celui-ci s'inscrit dans le cadre de l'exposition permanente temporaire du Musée d'ethnographie de Genève qui s'intitule « Injustice environnementale, alternative autochtone ». Nous vous invitons à venir la visiter jusqu'au 21 août 2022. Les artistes invités à participer à ces rendez-vous en ligne sont toutes et tous des artistes contemporains, autochtones et engagés, dont des œuvres sont présentées dans cette exposition. Et je peux déjà vous informer qu'une dernière rencontre aura lieu le 6 avril prochain. Pourquoi ces rencontres s'appellent-elles les rendez-vous du Gákte-Quipo? Parce qu'il faut que je passe à la dia suivante. Ces rendez-vous s'appellent les rendez-vous du Gákte-Quipo parce qu'ils prennent virtuellement place dans la dernière partie de l'exposition où se trouve une œuvre monumentale qui s'appelle le Gákte-Quipo, une œuvre qui a été réalisée par les artistes Maret Anesara et Cecilia Vicuña. Je sais. Voilà, ça marche. Enfin, je crois. Non, ça ne marche pas. Yes. Inspirée des quipus andins, cette œuvre est réalisée à l'aide de Gakti, des vestes mi-longues Sami. Et cette installation a été complétée en 2021 par des vêtements traditionnels des peuples autochtones de Sabah, en Malaisie, ainsi que par une œuvre de l'artiste simpiane Candy McGilton. Tout comme cette œuvre relie les histoires des luttes autochtones à travers le monde, l'idée de ces rencontres est de tisser des liens entre les artistes et le public. Durant les quelques premières minutes de ce rendez-vous, je vais vous présenter les deux artistes invités. Et pour donner un contexte, je vais brièvement commencer par introduire l'exposition en images. J'espère que ça va fonctionner. Est-ce que je partage quelque chose? Non. À l'aide d'une petite vidéo. Voici l'exposition. Pardonnez-moi pour ce problème technique. L'exposition à justice environnementale alternative autochtone s'appuie sur deux constats. Le premier constat, les peuples autochtones représentent 6% de la population mondiale et pour nombre d'entre eux, les changements climatiques est plus que jamais une réalité. Malgré leurs différences culturelles, ils partagent des préoccupations communes concernant la reconnaissance de leurs droits collectifs. Un deuxième constat, les faits démontrent que lorsque les peuples autochtones possèdent et contrôlent leurs terres, l'environnement et la biodiversité sont mieux protégés. Beaucoup d'entre eux partagent une éthique du soin et de la réparation, mise en œuvre au quotidien, non seulement pour réparer des objets, mais aussi et surtout pour prendre soin des rivières, des lacs, des forêts et des océans. Les savoirs et savoir-faire mobilisés qui sont continuellement renouvelés englobent entre autres la langue, la connaissance des plantes ou la spiritualité. Humains et non-humains ont des responsabilités réciproques les uns envers les autres. Dans cette optique relationnelle, un saumon, une rivière, un arbre ou une montagne sont des partenaires animés. Les peuples autochtones revendiquent l'important rôle qu'ils peuvent jouer dans la recherche d'alternatives afin de protéger les ressources naturelles pour les générations futures. Mais lorsque les équilibres ne sont plus maintenus, c'est la crise qui s'installe, la destruction continue des sols et les émissions causées par l'exploitation non durable des ressources accélèrent la crise climatique, qui, à son tour, accélère la dégradation des terres. De nombreux peuples autochtones affirment vivre toujours dans une relation de type colonial avec les États dans lesquels ils se trouvent, sans les avoir consultés préalablement, ni avoir obtenu leur consentement. Ces États donnent souvent la priorité à des activités de développement économique, telles que l'exploitation minière ou des projets hydroélectriques sur des terres traditionnellement occupées par des peuples autochtones. Et enfin, c'est sur un temps de la rencontre que se termine cette exposition, en invitant le public à voir, à entendre, à écouter des témoignages d'experts et d'artistes autochtones, et pourquoi pas, à faire le choix de prendre position et de s'allier aux peuples autochtones pour tisser un avenir commun, fondé sur des valeurs de soins, de réparation et de responsabilité à l'égard de toutes les formes du vivant. C'est donc aussi un moment de rencontre auquel nous vous invitons maintenant, dans ce rendez-vous d'artistes. Je vais maintenant vous présenter les artistes que nous recevons aujourd'hui. Cette rencontre est inédite. Elle fait se rencontrer et échanger deux artistes autochtones aux multiples facettes et qui exposent dans les plus grands musées du continent nord-américain. Ils sont invités ici aujourd'hui à questionner le rôle de l'artiste dans la mise en lumière des luttes autochtones. Les présenter en quelques mots n'est pas chose facile. Dans l'exposition Injustice environnementale alternative autochtone, nous ne présentons qu'une seule œuvre personnelle de chacun des artistes. Ces œuvres nous ont été prêtées par le NONAM, le Musée des Premières Nations d'Amérique du Nord de Zurich, que nous remercions chaleureusement et que nous vous invitons à aller visiter. Barry Ace est d'ascendance Odawa, citoyen de la Première Nation Chi-King de l'île Manitoulin, au nord du lac Huron, en Ontario, au Canada. Il vit actuellement à Ottawa. Dans son travail, Barry Ace s'intéresse à l'impact de l'ère numérique, des nouvelles technologies et des nouveaux moyens de communication, et à la manière dont ceux-ci transforment et infusent la culture Anishinaabe d'aujourd'hui. L'œuvre de Barry Ace, qui est présentée au MEG, est un sac en peau de loutre finement décoré d'éléments électroniques de récupération. Il est exposé dans une vitrine dédiée au Mino Bima Deziwin, le chemin d'une bonne vie, de la philosophie Anishinaabe. Cette vitrine fait partie du troisième espace-temps d'exposition, qui est consacré aux relations de réciprocité entre humains et non-humains. Comme dans d'autres philosophies autochtones, la préservation du bien-vivre sur la Terre, avec toutes les formes du vivant, dépend du soin que l'on porte aux relations d'interdépendance entre entités humaines et non humaines. Les motifs brodés font écho au perlage floral Anishinaabe qui reflète le transfert d'énergie et l'interconnectivité entre le monde des plantes médicinales. Comme dans d'autres de ses œuvres, Barry Ace crée une convergence entre l'historique et le contemporain. Il recompose ce langage floral Anishinaabe à l'aide de condensateurs et de cartes de circuits imprimés, des médias modernes qui sont également utilisés pour stocker et transmettre de l'énergie. Barry Ace crée aussi des œuvres collaboratives dans lesquelles il revisite les traditions Anishinaabe et l'histoire récente des peuples autochtones du Canada. L'art performatif est aussi une caractéristique importante des créations de Cannupa Hanska Luger. Né dans la réserve de Standing Rock dans le Dakota du Nord, il est membre inscrit des 3 tribus affiliées de Fort Berthold, Mandan, Hadaska, Arikara, et il est aussi d'ascendance Lakota. Il vit actuellement au Nouveau-Mexique. Dans le cadre de l'exposition Injustice environnementale alternative autochtone, c'est le projet Mirror Shield qui est présenté, le projet des boucliers miroirs. Ce projet s'intègre parfaitement dans la partie qui est consacrée à la crise et aux injustices environnementales. Il a créé ce projet en 2016 en soutien aux water protectors, les protecteurs de l'eau, qui conduisaient l'importante manifestation de Standing Rock pour dénoncer la construction de l'oléoduc Dakota Access. Le mouvement d'opposition des water protectors dénonçait la construction de cet oléoduc à travers leurs terres et les risques causés pour l'environnement et la qualité de l'eau des rivières. Son tutoriel vidéo diffusé sur les réseaux sociaux « How to build mirror shields for water protectors » invitait les sympathisants des manifestations de Standing Rock à fabriquer des boucliers miroirs pour les envoyer en soutien aux manifestants. Au-delà de ce projet, Cannupa Hanska Luger crée des installations monumentales dans lesquelles il met en œuvre des fictions spéculatives, comme, pour n'en citer qu'une, le projet Future Ancestral Technologies. Il associe des médias divers comme la céramique, la vidéo, le son, la fibre, l'acier, ainsi que les nouvelles technologies et les matériaux réutilisés. Il crée aussi des offres collaboratives et entremêle performance et action politique pour communiquer des histoires sur l'autochtonie du XXIe siècle. Voilà, je vais laisser maintenant la parole à Cannupa, Barry et Damien pour ce moment de rencontre. Je rappelle que pour poser des questions, n'hésitez pas à utiliser le système de questions-réponses qui se trouve en bas de votre fenêtre Zoom. Elles seront retransmises aux artistes dans les 10 dernières minutes de la rencontre. Si vous nous suivez sur Facebook et que vous souhaitez poser des questions, cliquez dans le lien en commentaire qui vous conduira à nous rejoindre sur Zoom. Belle rencontre.
Thank you, Lucie. Hello, Barry. Hello, Cannupa. Thank you for being here tonight. Many thanks. We wanted you. We have you. We are super happy. As a start, let's get back to the title of that meeting tonight, the role of the artists in highlighting Indigenous people's struggles. So my first question will be, what's your stance? What's your opinion on the title? What's your position? Do you feel that you have a role in highlighting your people's struggles? The floor is open. We can start with Barry.
Oh, wait, I'm sorry, I had the French translation on, so I didn't hear your question. I'm sorry.
No problem. I just said, since the title of this tonight's meeting is the role of the artist in highlighting Indigenous people's struggles, I was wondering what's your position on the question? Do you feel that you have a role? What's your role? How do you react to the title of the meeting?
My primary, I really want to talk about my primary audience, like who I do my work for, so I really talk about myself and my Anishinaabe community of who I do my work for. So, in my work, I strategically integrate my Anishinaabe, science, semiotics, the visual language, Anishinaabe Moin, and historical and contemporary narratives into my work. So, the work that I did for this particular exhibition, Spirit Vessel, that's included in environmental injustice, is deeply rooted in, I guess, my response to the impacts of colonization. So I guess that's where I'm kind of coming from, where I had to actually research and had to relearn how to make cultural arts and sacred objects as a reparative act. So that's kind of like where I see myself fitting in with my work and with the exhibition.
Yeah, so, I would also think it's interesting to have to be in the position to highlight the struggle of Indigenous people as artists, where I think even what Barry's kind of leaning into, but myself, I believe that we are kind of in the role of celebrating our survivance, to maintain these cultures, to share them with future generations, to share them with our contemporary peers and community. I don't think it's as much a highlight of the struggle as it is a celebration of our existence, which has been kind of undermined for a few centuries now.
Okay, so it's about survivance. Yes, celebrating survivance. What's your opinion on the idea of, because you are obviously your art is shown in many museums around the world. So Barry just talked about his own community. So it appears that he first and foremost address his art to his own community. What's your position in the idea of indigenous cultures? Do you feel a oneness in that term, in that expression? Do you feel a oneness in the idea that you are part of a bigger group of indigenous peoples?
Well, it'd be like saying, like, do you identify as a European? It's like, well, you're Swiss or you're German or whatever. I mean, to group to say that we're kind of like in a homogeneous group is a fallacy. I mean, within Canada alone, there's 52 distinct languages that are spoken. There's over 650 communities. There's great cultural diversity, linguistic diversity. So, we are different nations, but one thing that we all share in common is that we are still resisting the impact of colonization.
Yeah, I would also agree with that kind of notion. There is immense complexity, and I think indigenous peoples have been reduced to a monolith. The process of making us a monolith, the process of making us singular, also makes us one-dimensional. And I don't think that there has been an incredible effort nationally and or globally to understand the complexity of indigenous cultures at large. And I think even having these opportunities and describing ourselves and positioning ourselves with indigenous people is also in response to colonization. We've had many other monikers that have been kind of placed over us, many different umbrellas to stand underneath, but there's not enough room in that space for all of us. And it really undermines the diversity of our knowledge. We are kind of regionally, our cultures are developed by the landscapes that we exist in, that we're an extension of. And I think without understanding that relationship, then that was kind of like our primary source of trade and communication. As our cultures prior to contact interacted with one another, there were protocols that were embedded by a culture that existed in this particular landscape for generations upon generations. And that information was shared between tribes on how to exist, adapt, or exit said landscapes, So I think it's important to recognize that, but also to understand that, like, even the term indigenous, that allows us to actually kind of engage with intersections on a global level. Like, who are the indigenous people of the region that you're in presently? It's not about race or culture, but rather this belonging to the landscape versus those who have kind of been either dislocated through a whole variety of things, whether that's empire building or slavery or and all of these different kind of models that have moved people around the globe. So it goes both ways.
yes. But that's really interesting. I have a question maybe, and I mean, it's important to be for that to be understood here in Europe and in the world. So please respond very openly and freely to my question. But we tried in this exhibition to obviously mix different messages from different indigenous groups around the world. So my question is, do you find that insulting in a way to be put together in such an exhibition, or are you okay with that? How do you react to that?
I'll go, Barry.
Okay.
I like it. I like being, I like the opportunities that the Western gaze kind of forces Indigenous people to be lumped in these sort of things. But I like the global network that can be developed by those relationships. The reality, like Barry had mentioned before, is that what we share in common is the kind of empire building colonization narrative of, you know, the 15th, 16th, 17th century, 18th century, just like intention to like take over the entire globe. So we share a lot of similarities in that aspect, but the variety and complexity of our relationships to places, the kind of like effort to have a global Indigenous network by through the Western gaze, for my own personal experience, has allowed me to engage with Indigenous communities kind of globally, and then begin to see our intersectional spaces, our parallels, our and then also where we are absolutely contradictory to one another, you know. And I think that development is more akin to an Indigenous model here in the Americas prior to contact, where we acknowledged that there was diversity and complexity between nations. And so this allots me the opportunity to engage with and meet folks across the globe who are, if they don't self-identify as Indigenous, they are gazed upon as Indigenous to the landscape. So I'm happy to be in that community because there is, you know, overlying this sense of belonging to the landscape, which is so contrary to the empire building kind of Western expansion idea, you know.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on the point about the gaze, you know, in terms of my work being positioned within the context of the exhibition, you know, the gaze is very different when my work is presented to a non-Anishinaabe critical audience. And it can sometimes be, you know, extremely challenging and not always fully accessible. You know, for the most part, when my work appeals to a non-Anishinaabe viewer, it's often purely on an aesthetic level, since it doesn't, you know, readily reveal all of its secrets or translate its specific embedded code. So, and this is due to the viewer's external gaze and not really knowing about an object's history or its cultural context or how it came to be in terms of its development, you know, in a long line of linear history. It's next to impossible to totally understand a contemporary work without knowing what it is in response to, what came before it, and its cultural legacy, you know, what came first, after, and so forth. So without this integral and imperative, you know, knowledge and information, it can only superficially be comprehended and evaluate on its aesthetic appeal. You know, as I noted earlier, you know, my secondary audience really is non-Anishinaabe. So, you know, I don't make a concerted effort to appeal or to be understandable to an international audience. Like my practice, I'm addressing the impacts of colonization first and foremost, which is like, you know, is clearly understandable to an Anishinaabe audience. And I understand, and in terms of like an international audience and a domestic audience for that matter, I really think it's the sole responsibility of any outside audience, whether it's a curator, critical writer, an art gallery, museum, or even the general public, to make a concerted effort to understand the concept and really to embrace decolonization, which requires a lot of work on their part in order to better understand my own work. So, you know, without this will and effort, an outsider audience will usually fall into what I call an outsider's gaze, which is a subjugation of the original meaning and intent of my work. In other words, they simply default towards, I guess, like a heartwarming or a seductive or even a sympathetic desire to embrace the exoticism of otherness. I also think that it's important to note that, you know, these emotive responses are not unique to my work in particular, for they can also be extrapolated to all the other works in the exhibition or in contemporary Indigenous art. And this is really traced back to the longstanding and dominant histories and control of museological representation of Indigenous arts, you know, in Western mausoleum type institutions, and the impact of the devastation and intrusion of salvage archaeology, you know. So with these histories in mind, my work can be understood like as a direct response or a challenge to those, omnipresent and visceral constructions of anthropology and ethnology. So Western social sciences have historically encapsulated us into a mythological stasis, and relegated our cultural arts into a contained and manageable hierarchical concept of classification as lower grade art, and I mentioned this when we briefly talked before, I take issue with the term craft, because craft is a deeply rooted and devalued misogynist attitude towards women's work and cultural arts that are outside of the dominant culture, such as Indigenous. And ironically, my practice overtly embraces and draws heavily from these relegated and sidelined cultural arts, where I strategically, coalesce the historical and contemporary. And then I represent it back to Western contemporary art institutions. But I'm very conscious of maintaining a hyper-awareness, of my work's cultural relevance for my own community and the innovation and progression when viewed by an Anishinaabe audience.
Thank you. This raised a lot of new questions from me. But what's your position on the matter, Cannupa? Barry just said that he has a first and a second, quote unquote, secondary audience. Do you feel the same? Do you feel that way as well?
Yeah, I do feel the same. My immediate tribal community group is, 15,000 people and getting smaller due to kind of embedded colonial responses. We have like blood quantuming issues in my community. So our population is actually reducing due to us policing ourselves, so it's fascinating because I can't end my conversation with my immediate community. I believe they are a part of the audience that can glean the most information out of the work that I'm producing, because they have the cultural context, but beyond that, I recognize most of my work is viewed outside of my community. They don't really have access. We're from North Dakota. We live up on the Missouri River. I would say 2/3 or maybe half of our population is dislocated, living in urban centers. And that group has very little kind of relationship back home to the Missouri River and the cultures that are existing there. And I myself have also like grown up on and off of the reservation, but going to school in urban centers and engaging with urban Indigenous people. There is a huge number of our population in the United States that have been dislocated from their ancestral lands by being relocated into urban centers. And it's like a community without a land-based practice. So they have a diasporic kind of experience within those regions, but moreover, embedded in like an ultra-capitalist colonial urban center, a city, of all of this information. And most of my work is exhibited within these hubs, these culture hubs. So I'm always really interested in addressing that relationship to land and that dislocation to land for Indigenous people, even on the landscape that they were a part of. And I think a lot of that has to go back to what Barry was talking about as well, which is the Western gaze, the European model, particularly that which was brought over from Britain and Spain. There is, in the academy and in the museum, there's an emphasis on preservation. These things have to be preserved, and I've watched through the like naturalist growth of Western kind of knowledge and science and all of this. They're happy to kill a beautiful bird, wrap it in gauze and send it back to the museum to be a model and an example of this creature, where that creature is most kind of like informative information as a species is in its life, in its movement, in how it performs and creates nests, how it breeds within its community, its dances, and all of these things are lost by annihilating it and preserving it. So to be sequestered in glass is to kill the creature itself. And I think a lot of Indigenous cultures have been embedded in that same exact model. Preserve preserve the idea of them, but kill the body, annihilate the thing entirely. And then let's put it in glass and move it into the back of the museum. Let's paint the walls dark so that as the audience enters into this space, they can see time on a linear level. This entire culture is prehistoric, and so it exists in a cave, and you navigate through these spaces. That creates like a psychological relationship to your audience, to Indigenous people, which is that it's primitive, relegated. I always like to say relicated, turned into a relic, an object of the past, positioned. And this is an entire culture that's living and breathing. And I think our primary models culturally is maintenance. We've been able to preserve things longer than any museum by maintaining it rather than preserving it, which means it changes over time. You feed it, you take care of it, you repair where it's damaged, or you let go of it entirely. But all of that is a process of maintenance. And I think that process, any object that exists within a museum space was carried by people for over 1,000 years by maintaining it. And now we don't have access to those objects because we don't have the facilities to preserve them in the models that they've presently been preserved. My argument always is, yeah, but the only reason you have it is because we carried it for 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 years, and it's a completely different paradigm, and I'm interested in sharing maintenance as a cultural imperative versus preservation. So whoever that audience is who's willing to engage with culture and museum as a maintenance process, that's my audience. That's who I want to engage with and celebrate the responsibility of taking care of your ancestors in a way for future generations.
Can I just jump in on that as well? Like,
sure, go on.
What's really lacking when I look at especially museum installations of historic cultural arts, for example, is they've totally lost the context and meaning of the work itself. For example, a historical mask hanging in a glass vitrine, has lost its story, it's lost its song, it's lost its dance, it's lost its maker, it's lost its community. So it's gone, it's turned into an objet d'art. It's what it is. It's totally lost its context. And even when you look at the contemporary work, that's often missed because, in my own personal experiential, like the cultural experience are so important to the making of my work. And these experiences, interweave and they transcend and they coalesce into my contemporary art practice. For example, working directly with Anishinaabe basket makers like my great aunt, Annie Ellen McGregor, or Anishinaabe potters like David Migwas. So I follow a culture-based approach, which relies on an autobiographical narrative that situates myself within the context of, Anishinaabe B'Madazuin, which is Anishinaabe culture. And that really reveals the important aspects of my personal life and my experience. And they engage also with the adverse impacts of colonization on the traditional art practice. So what's missing is how these lived experiences has influenced the development of the research and the work. So my art making is rooted deeply in a culture-based methodology, learning by experience, shared knowledge, immersion in cultural practices. And it's important to note that this approach is very different and distinct and in contradistinction to Western academic training. And the whole aspect of this notion of having to go back and do a reparative act on our arts. It's because many of those cultural arts have been removed from the communities. Imposed legislative acts of forced assimilation have disrupted the transfer of that traditional knowledge, language, and spirituality. And many of these historical objects only exist in museum collections and ethnographic-based drawings, even in the work of Karl Bodmer, Swiss artist. It's important to note that that my research and investigation into Bodemer's depictions of us are not about reproducing an object as an exact replica, but it's about leveraging that inspiration that I get from the drawings, you know. But I have to go back because so many objects have been removed or lost that a lot of our material culture exists only within museum collections or only within these drawings. So, you know, it's difficult because, you know, to address and produce work as a culture-based mentorship, you know, there's few and far between people in many communities because a lot of that, the language, the culture, spirituality, traditional knowledge have been stripped from the communities. And so that's why we're in a reparative act and working towards, you know, cultural revitalization.
Thank you very much. I don't want for that speak to turn into something too artsy, but let me just ask you a question. How do you react to your art, Barry and Cannupa, being encased in glass in museums? What do you use the case as a statement in a way to prove the how wrong it is for it to be encased, or do you have another yeah?
I think it's wrong.
Yeah. I think it's wrong as well. I mean, I'm in 100% agreement with that. It's strange to experience these objects that are culturally significant, that are embedded in utility. You know, these are to be used, and to put them in glass removes even, you know, it removes even proximity to the work. But I have utilized that space in conversation before. I did a series of ceramic iPhones that had photographic decals on it of information that was shared through, and this was produced in 2016, 2017, somewhere around there. But in the US, there was a pipeline running across right above my reservation in North Dakota, or the Standing Rock Reservation, my father's side of it. And I was using information that was being shared through phones. And the pieces were called The Weapon is Sharing. And it looked like images being shared back and forth on the screen of a phone in communication. And the final statement on both of them is "This machine kills fascists," which was a nod back to Woody Guthrie's guitar, you know, a text that was embedded on or scribed into the Woody Guthrie's guitar. But that image back and forth, I took those ceramic phones because there is a compulsive consumption of indigenous objects. There's a lot of ceramic pieces that have been found, dug up, pieced back together and exposed in museums. And so I buried these phones in dirt and forced antiquity onto the shape, onto the materiality of it, onto the clay. And then I really wanted to describe that this ceramic vessel is the same as a jar or a knife or any other tool that's used by indigenous people. And I wanted it to be a conversation with the other objects that are trapped. So it was a way to communicate to my ancestors through the museum's kind of compulsive drive to have native tools, you know, indigenous objects, and forcing antiquity onto it. It was really playing into the categorical gaze of antiquity and relegation to past. So I was like, here's a modern device. It's made out of clay. It ticks all the boxes for museum kind of compulsion around cultural objects, but it's also a vessel for communication, and it can potentially express where we're at presently in the 21st century to our ancestors that are also trapped in museums who we don't have access to. So it's like trying to send a message through the museum's kind of compulsive demand for Indian objects, you know. or indigenous or native or primitive even, objects as a way to kind of play with that methodology.
Yeah, that's really true, and the notion of like putting the work into a glass showcase, shows that, presents it in a way that we're either in a stasis, or our culture is in demise, or we're non-existent anymore. When I exhibited my Nagik Makazanan, my otter moccasins that were shown earlier, in the exhibition at the National Gallery of Canada called Abadakwene, which translates to continuous fire. I told them I did not want that put into a glass showcase. The section that my work was in was about animating work. So what we did was, we had those otter tail trail dusters raised on a oval plinth and exposed to actually animate the object, to put it into that type of a context. Also put in tobacco within the object itself. So it was open, and because it is animate, it's alive, and it to contain that energy and contain that object, I think degrades the work itself. And it lasted through the entire exhibition. No one tore pieces off it or did anything to it. And I think people had a closer and a more meaningful interaction than peering through a barrier or a glass at an object and not feel its energy and its connection.
Thank you. Yes, so that object was exposed in Canada. Would you have the same expectation for the Western audience to understand it here in Europe, or was that a place-specific installation?
Well, I think there's new approaches that need to be taken in terms of presenting our work, and I think there should be close communication, interaction with the particular artist that's doing the work. I don't see why it could not be embraced in that way. I know one thing I like as well, it was at the North American Native Museum in Zurich, Switzerland, who own a couple of my pieces, for example. I did a small piece with a skateboard and a beaded skateboard bag, and that was actually integrated into a historical regalia section. And so, so when people went through it, especially school groups went through it, they were going, oh, Anishinaabe people have skateboards, it's like it breaks down that whole notion that we are no longer, or in contemporary society. So I think, and having that not within a glassed-in showcase also shows that it is alive. And there is there is an interaction that takes place between the viewer and the object if there's no barriers between the two. I think that breaks down those barriers as well, having it exposed.
Yes, thank you for the clarification. Going back to what you said before, you raised the question of colonialism, and yeah, that's a huge subject in itself. Do you want? How should I say that? Do you feel the need for a political message to shine through your art when you expose that either in Europe or within your communities?
I think here in the United States, it's hard to not do that, but I don't think it's necessarily it's not necessarily intentional. The way that we're engaged with domestically, we are political entities, whether we like it or not. So there is, is it a responsibility for us as artists or as Indigenous people to create political messages? Not necessarily. Just our existence is inherently political. You kind of amplify that through being original members of and extensions of the landscape of the region, and then colonization and land theft and all of the resources that have been extracted from that landscape inherently puts us in a position of politics, because it's embedded in economy and value and money and currency, you know, that's kind of moved across the globe. So it's interesting, as an Indigenous person, I feel that same inherent politicism even in Europe, considering the amounts of wealth that has been drawn from our landscape, our relatives, our grandparents, our elders, our ancestors. All of that wealth had been stripped and annexed and sent overseas to gild churches and pave streets and build, you know, all of these sorts of things. So there's like an embedded politicizing that is hard to escape in any sort of way. And I feel as though even maintaining our cultural practices at present is a political act, considering the policies that went into action that tried to eradicate us in the first place. So our existence is you know, political, and is also a form of resistance in general, you know. So yeah, but I don't know if it's like necessarily a choice, but rather it's like an external evaluation, whether we like it or not. So sometimes I lean into it, sometimes I lean way back, and sometimes when I'm leaning way back, that's actually an even stronger political positionality, you know. So it's challenging, but I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I'd be interested what Barry has to say with that.
No, I agree. I always look at it. I say that anything I make is political. You know, it's all a response to the adverse impact of colonization, from literally having to relearn traditional knowledge and cultural arts, relearn language, relearn spirituality and ceremony, go out and locate cultural arts objects, you know, that were removed from our communities. You know, since, you know, Anishinaabe and other Indigenous peoples were impacted and continue to be impacted by colonization and political forces of the dominant culture, then anything that I make is entirely political, from the making of the work to the finished work to its public presentation. It's embedded, it's inherent in it. So, you know, regardless of whether you're actually doing the work that is a political statement, just the act of making that work as an Indigenous artist, as an Indigenous person, is political.
Thank you very much. It's we have to close the session. Oh, yeah, it's already 8:50. We have to close soon enough. But I see that there is a question. Do you mind, Lucy, if I read the question? Yeah,
no, of course. Please go for it. I think it's a very interesting question.
So there I'm just reading it right now. So there seem to be two questions. So it's related to what we said before with the encasing of the relation to museums. So here's the question: how do you think museums could embark on the culture of maintenance you described? That's the first question. And what should they change the museums in their museum displays or relationships with cultural belongings they care for?
Well, you know, I'll just jump there. That's a really good question. There's so many aspects to it. One aspect of it, you know, I talked a lot about salvage, you know, anthropology, you know, where objects have been removed from our communities and leaving some communities totally devoid of objects that were originally made by them and their families. You know, museums, you know, should be engaging and in communication with communities about returning these objects to communities, or at least setting up some kind of way that invites the communities to come and view them and visit them because they are animate objects, to reconnect them with the community from which they belong. So there's all kinds of different ways that communities can be engaged with, and also too, to bring in and share this knowledge with specific communities in terms of the making it. I've been lucky in having the opportunity to travel internationally. I've gone into museums, and I always document. I locate objects that relate to Anishinaabe, and I keep a running record of where these things are, because we just don't know. The federal government of Canada actually had a policy whereby they had the potlatch, Northwest Coast potlatch, Sundance, Medewan ceremonies, Anishinaabe, where they basically went in and seized objects from our communities because they were forcing us into a Western culture, and sold off our material culture and cultural objects internationally, so that they're dispersed around the globe. So, I think that's just one aspect of that question I think I can address.
Yeah, I would be intrigued. The model, this museum model is antiquated itself. It's, let's say in the best case scenario, its original design was to create a hub for education. Like, we can gather these cultures from all over the globe because we are intrepid explorers. During the age of exploration, there was, which was the age of we used to call it the apocalypse, but this age of exploration moved across the globe and began to pull in all of these pieces. So, the museum and that sort of space became a hub to share the stolen knowledge, the stolen artifacts, the stolen cultures. I mean, not just objects came back with those, people came back with those. Human lives came back in that time to be exhibited in the same sort of model, and we still perpetuate that in museums, and there are still bodies in museums, that are a part of that exploration and annexing of culture. But we live in a different time now. I mean, here we are. You have an Anishinaabe and a Mandan Hidatsa Rikara person telling you the stories about our present existence, sharing it through our cultural works. And now the value of this conversation is suddenly profound, and I don't think we've celebrated that sort of engagement, and how that undermines the power of a museum in cultural contexts at large. We could create more of these opportunities, and in return, give us back some of our ancestors. You could literally, we have the capacity at this point, through communications technology, to engage with every culture across the globe, nearly, and with a little bit of effort, I think that we could, and I think wealthy countries could shoulder the burden of that engagement with human beings and cultures as living things rather than objects. We are in process. We are verbs. We are becoming. And until a museum recognizes that a culture is not an object and cannot be consumed or taught about in that fashion, our greatest resource is our ability to communicate to one another. And we have the technology now to do that. So a museum could be a hub for that sort of maintenance, rather than a safety deposit box for the incredibly wealthy. It could become a hub for cultural communication, and context to the objects that already exist within those spaces, and as a way to express gratitude for that cultural exchange. Some of these objects could be returned to the people that are still living, thriving, and existing as a culture, and suddenly the objects that have been kind of held in stasis the capacity for us to learn knowledge from those things, to share, to engage with those not as objects, which from my experience going into museums and having access to some of these pieces, I have to engage with them as an object. I have to put on white cotton gloves, you know, be very careful about how I engage with all of these materials, but I don't get to take them home, and I don't get to put them back in the earth or wrap them back and feed them, give them tobacco. I don't get the opportunity to do that. So what I do is I look at the piece not as an object, but as a process. Like, there is a story being told in this, and even though I can't bring home the object, I can bring home the knowledge that this object has been screaming to express for a century, 2 centuries now. And I can take that home and I can share that with my community. And then we can develop an understanding of what those relationships were to those sorts of things. So I think it would be interesting to consider the position and the place of a museum in a 21st century context. And in doing so, we really have to look at our what it is we want to value in a museum. You know, is it a center for education, or is it a safety deposit box for the world's wealth? You know, that eventually trickles down to a very few hands. You know, so yeah, I don't know. It would be interesting, and I think it would be a bold move on an international level to consider culture as a living thing, and that the museum itself has tragically undervalued the cultures that it's representing. And museums, that's not just Indigenous, that's across the board.
Yeah, exactly. And museums need to change. They need to move away from the mausoleum, which is what a museum is, and having objects that are made by artists unknown to objects that are artists once known and artists who have names associated with those particular objects.
Thank you. Just to keep on talking about that, do you, because yeah, there are I have different experiences with that kind of questions. Do you feel in your case, Cannupa and Barry, that objects are still somehow alive in the museum, so you could reanimate them by bringing them back home?
Yeah, of course they are. They're the language itself. You know, our languages, as most Indigenous languages, are animate and inanimate. So when we were talking about a certain object, the language reinforces its spirit, its energy. You know, like a bead, a glass bead. You know, we call a manadominense. You know, it's a spirit energy berry. It's a berry that has energy. And it's alive, you know. So, and then when you take an electronic component that I use that works with technology, antiquated technology, you know, that is also, when it's injected with energy, it becomes alive as well. So these objects are often, English doesn't reinforce, or French, you know, just turns into masculine or feminine, but it doesn't give it the animation or that sense of being alive. In its linguistic structure.
Yeah, it's, you know, I think even our relationship to cultures, like we express cultures through that Western gaze and through that academic kind of model as nouns, as objects. You know, the Western kind of model is to compartmentalize everything into its like simplest or smallest kind of component. But in between all of those things is a vast amount of energy. Like these particles are singular points, but the majority of our universe is relationship. You know, that's the majority of our universe. And I think we're starting to recognize that even through Western science. But that was like embedded in Indigenous knowledge from a long time ago. And I think the relationship to objects removed, and even this idea of time, like how long can something starve in a museum before it's fed and it's absolutely dead? Like it can live in there as long as the people are alive, you know, no matter what they look like, as long as the stories and the relationships and the cultures that have developed these sorts of things exist, then the objects of our ancestors still have life. Everything is its life, and it is an extension of that, you know. The object has been confused and reduced to a particle, but it's actually a relationship. All of the visual language that you see embedded in that is an invocation of that spirit. It's a conduit to hold its relationship to its community, and a reminder on how to engage with it, and also revitalize, you know, bring it back, and maintenance. Once again, like there's information on how to care for it embedded in the material itself. So yeah, I think it's kind of fascinating to even question.
Thank you. That's a subject that fascinates me, and I've had a different answer from different people. So some people just told me, "You've killed the object. Now it's in museum. It's dead. You've killed it. So we cannot reanimate it." So there are different stances on the matter, but it's very precious to have yours. That may be your role as an artist, telling that to us today. It's already 8 o'clock. We'll have to end this session. I'm deeply sorry. I would love to have it going on longer and longer. Do we have other questions, Lucy?
I don't think we have any other question. And thank you so much for answering this one. That was very interesting to us as a museum. And so maybe should I close our meeting, Damien?
Yes, then please close the meeting, so I won't have to do that.
So I can thank you, Barry and Cannupa, for this very profound, so interesting conversation. Thank you for sharing your insight on colonization and on the role of museums in the 21st century. I think we really have to hear what you say and learn from it. So it was very, very interesting to hear you, and thank you for your time. Thank you so much, and hope we meet you soon again. It was great. Thank you.
Pleasure, Barry. Nice talking with you.
Good talking with you too. Bye.
And everyone, Amy and Lucy, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Bye-bye. Have a good day. Have a good night.
Good afternoon.